Okay, so I'll make this shorter because I know my last one was long. Sorry about that. But this is what we want to focus on. That's a critical look on proportional relationships. How can we write an equation for proportional relationships so we can find different values quickly? So it says Stephanie drove at a constant speed. If you remember back to seventh grade, that word constant, that means proportional. And her friend's house is 20 miles away. It took her 45 minutes to reach her destination. What fraction represents her constant speed, c? Again, we changed that variable around. I don't know why, but our constant speed, in this case c, remember is always going to be distance divided by time. So if I want to know what fraction represents that, I am going to take my distance of 20 miles over my time of 45 minutes. Okay, 20 over 45. Don't overthink it. Don't put any extra room into it or extra work into it. We're trying to come up with some ratios we can set together into a proportion to write an equation. So what fraction represents the constant speed? C. Constant speed is distance divided by time. If it takes her X number of minutes to get halfway to her friend's house. Okay? Halfway to her friend's house? Well, her friend's house, remember, is 20 miles. So halfway. See, look for those little things. I probably like try to trick you in there, but you know that half of 20 is 10. So my distance is 10, and my time, and I'll write miles again. My time, this time is X number of minutes. So I'm just gonna write an X minutes. Write and solve a proportion using these two fractions. Well, we just set them equal to each other. Miles has to be across from miles, minutes across from minutes. So 20 over 45. 20 miles is going to be across from 10 miles. 45 minutes is going to be across from X minutes. And then you can just use cross products to determine how many minutes it takes to get to the halfway point, because that's what we don't know. 20 times X has to equal whatever 45 is times 10, well, 450. And if we're solving for X and we have to get rid of the 20, it's 20 times X, so we do the inverse, the opposite. We divide. And you go 450 divided by 20, 22.5. 22.5. What? Well, X is the number of minutes, so it takes 22 and a half minutes. Okay. Just like we did before, I know in that super long video, but we're writing different ratios, fractions, and we're setting them equal to each other to solve for the unknown. Now we can do this again, but this time we're going to come up with an equation. Notice it says write a two-variable equation to represent how many miles Stephanie can drive over any time interval. Okay, well, our time interval, X number of minutes. Okay, so we're going to say X minutes. How many miles? We're going to call that Y. D, T, doesn't really matter, okay? But we have to take the ratio we know. Pointing at my screen that you guys can't see me doing. 20 miles over 45 minutes. We need to write that one down. This is the rate. And then we set it equal to two variable equation, a X and a Y, a D and a T. Okay, so the number of miles here, Y. Time interval, X. Minutes, miles. Then cross products. 45 times Y has to equal 20 times X. Always solve for Y. Okay, or whatever's on top. If you had a D on top, solve for D. So we're going to divide both sides by 45. Now in this case, if I were to go 20 divided by 45, I get 0.4 repeating. When we get repeating, we don't tend to want to write as decimals because there's going to be some rounding that happens. So you could leave this as 20 over 45 times X, or you could reduce it. We could write this as, well, 5 divides both of these. 5 goes into 20 4 times, 5 goes into 49 9 times, and we get 4 9s x. But now this equation would allow us to, for any time, we could figure out the number of miles. You know, however many minutes you want to put in, we can figure out the number of miles. One last thing. I'm not taking the time to derive this problem here, but what I just said, how we can figure out the number of minutes. In your homework, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to derive an equation. So we're going to pretend that we've gone through that already. The equation that represents how many miles y Dave traveled after x hours is y equals 50x plus 15. The number of miles equals 50 times the number of hours plus 15. Use the equation to complete the table below. So we can use the equations to figure out how far we travel in a certain number of hours. Okay, don't overthink this. You've done this type of problem before. We're just now talking about it in terms of proportional. Well, this isn't proportional, but in terms of hours and miles. So all we're going to do is take this number x here, and we're going to plug it in every time. Okay, so I'm going to say 50 times 2 plus 15. That's 115. Okay, 50 times 2 is 100 plus 15. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but you can just type this stuff into a calculator. My x is 3. I'm going to go 50 times 3 plus 15. That works out to be 165. We can do it for half, for decimals, right? We can go 50 times 3.5, 3.5. Put that in a calculator, add 15 into it. We would travel 190 miles. 4.1, no problem. Whatever the number of hours are, you just have to plug it into the formula that we came up with or are going to come up with, and it'll tell you the number of miles. So that's the power of coming up with an equation that we can use for future values.